Okay, guys, today's lecture is about Chapter 6 of Fauber. Chapter 6 is about exposure technique factors. These are something that you guys have heard about since you started the program, probably even before you started the program when you did your job shadow experience last summer. I'm sure the techs mentioned, or the students you might have seen talk to you about setting technique or things like that. And you just smiled and nodded because you didn't really understand what they meant, but now you do. We're getting there, right? In Unit 1, when we talked about quality and quantity of radiation, and we looked at those X-ray emission spectrum, and we saw what happens when you increase or decrease your MAS or your KVP or whatever it was. We could see how technical factors changed what comes out of the X-ray tube. We also talked about what happens in the X-ray tube. So we've covered that aspect of it. We also have talked about in Unit 2, we talked about radiographic quality. We talked about your brightness, your contrast, all of those kind of things. So we've talked about what happens in the tube, and we've talked about what happens in the image, but now we're just putting it together. Basically, that's what's going on in Chapter 6. In this unit, you guys have chapters 6, 8, and 9, which seems like a ton, but really the most new material, I would say, which isn't new, is here in chapter 6. There is quite a bit of stuff, but you guys are already familiar with a lot of it, so don't stress out about it too much. As always, you guys have objectives. You may have noticed my PowerPoints for this unit are really fancy. I don't know. I was feeling myself when I made these things last year. If you don't like them, you can definitely download them from Moodle and change the format. They are a little bit extra, and your class actually has a lot of male student technologists, and they may or may not enjoy seeing my purple and my frilly looking stuff for this chapter. Anyways, objectives. We're going to explain the relationship between milliamperage and exposure time with radiation production and image receptor exposure. We're going to calculate changes in milliamperage and exposure time to change or maintain exposure to the IR. We're going to compare the effects of changes in milliamperage and exposure time on digital and film screen images. Recognize how to correct exposure factors for a density error. Explain how kilovoltage peak affects radiation production and IR exposure. Calculate changes in KVP to change or maintain exposure to the IR. Compare the effects of change in KVP on digital and film screen images. Recognize the factors that affect spatial resolution and distortion. Calculate changes in MAS for changes in SID. Calculate magnification factor and determine image and object size. Describe the use of grids and beam restrictors and their effect on IR exposure and image quality. Calculate the changes in the MAS when adding or removing a grid. Recognize patient factors that may affect IR exposure. Identify the exposure factors that can affect patient radiation exposure. And state exposure technique modifications for the following considerations: body habitus and patient thickness. Lots of objectives. Hopefully, whenever you look at those objectives, you see now why I did the scatter control chapter before I did this chapter, because you have to know about grids and you have to know about scatter production to understand technique. Okay, your textbook has this information broken down as primary exposure factors and secondary exposure factors. Obviously, your primary exposure factors, kind of like the name suggests, are the main ones, like the big ones. Whenever I say, what technique are you going to set, you're going to tell me your MAS and your KVP, right? You're not going to tell me I would utilize 0.2 copper filtration, whatever. Like, we don't figure those into our daily use. They do have an effect on image exposure, image receptor exposure, excuse me, and the way that our images are going to look whenever we finish our exam, but they're not things that you're going to change primarily. Your primary exposure factors We always think about, like I said, MAS and KVP, but it's not just your MAS and your KVP. Recall that your MAS is really milliamperage and time. So there's really three primary exposure factors: your MA, your time, and your kilovolt peak. As far as the tube is concerned, remember that whenever we change our MA, we are changing the number of electrons that are boiled off at the filament to go across the tube and interact with the anode. Whenever we change the exposure time, we are changing the amount of time that those electrons are being boiled off to go across. So they do the same thing in the long run, but they are separate. So we do have to consider them separately. Because they both are directly proportional to radiation quantity, that is, if you have more number of electrons boiled off, you're going to have a greater number of X-ray photons produced. They are both directly proportional to that radiation quantity. But when you are maintaining your MAS, if you are increasing the time and decreasing the MA or vice versa, they are inversely proportional to each other. So don't mess that up on an exam, because you'll probably have some questions about that. You know, I like to ask you about the relationship between things. Our other primary exposure factor is our kilovoltage, our KVP. That's what we always call it. KVP is a little bit trickier than MAS. MAS just changes your quantity of radiation produced. That's it. It does not change anything else. It's easy peasy. Your KVP changes both your quality and your quantity. Your KVP is directly proportional to the quality, and then it's proportional to the quantity, but it's not direct. Recall that if you increase your KVP by 15%, you double your exposure. So it's not a double your KVP, double your exposure situation like it is with the MAS. Just like I said a second ago, when you change your MAS, you change your MA or your time, you're going to have a direct change in the number of photons in your beam. If we were in class, I like to do, well, you guys know, I like to do stupid things to make you pay attention. And one of the things that I'll do in class is grab those whiteboard markers at the front of the room, and I'll throw one across the room. Not real hard, but just toss one. And then I'll say, okay, if I change MAS, I take a handful of them and throw them across the room. It's the same thing. You're changing the number of the photons, okay? This slide is just showing you guys the relationship between MA and time. If you double your MA, you're going to double your MAS. If you double your time, you're going to double your MAS. They are both directly proportional to the number of X-ray photons emitted. But like I said, they are inversely proportional to each other. Whenever you guys, excuse me, I just got a text from a clinical instructor. Sorry about that. They are inversely proportional to each other when you are maintaining MAS. So this is one of those things where if you're doing a math problem, you need to really ask yourself, what is this question asking me? If it's asking you to maintain the exposure to the IR, but to use, say, a shorter exposure time or something like that, then you're going to have to change one up and one down because they're inversely proportional to each other. But if I say in a math problem like, this X-ray had inadequate exposure to the IR, how could you change it? You could either double your MA or double your time or whatever it is, because you don't want to maintain the same exposure if it wasn't enough exposure, right? So keep that in mind whenever you guys are doing these. I have, I think, some math worksheets that have some MAS problems on them. Pretty straightforward. One thing that you have to recall with doing your MAS is that MAS is milliamperage times seconds. So if you have a problem that gives you milliseconds or something like that, or fractions of seconds. A lot of older equipment, especially, used to, you would have to select your MA and then you have to select your fraction of a second, not milliseconds like it is now. But make sure that you can work with these things before we have our next exam. Okay, so I told you that the MAS is straightforward. Changing your MA or changing your time is going to change your MAS, and MAS is directly proportional to the number of electrons in the tube, which is directly proportional to the number of X-rays produced. If you don't believe me, and you are just feeling like you really want to go investigate something, you can go in your Bushong book on page 137. There is math, and you guys will do it later. We're not going to do it now, so don't freak out. But there is math, and I can give you an MAS value, and you guys can calculate the exact number of electrons that are going to pass through the X-ray tube for that exposure. So it is true. Don't just believe it because I'm telling you. Although I would never steer you wrong. But you can go investigate that if you would like. There is math to prove that when you increase your MA, you increase your number of electrons. Now, with your KVP, there's also math for that. I don't require you to do it, but that relationship is in the Bushong book also. There is something on page 136 in the Bushong book, and then there's also something in chapter 7 of Bushong. I can't remember the exact page, but it talks about the relationship between kinetic energy of the electrons and how that translates to X-ray energy. Remember that your KVP is affecting not the number of electrons crossing the tube, but how fast they're crossing the tube. Voltage is an electromotive force. What does that mean? Electromotive. It means it moves electrons. So whenever that focusing cup becomes activated, when we make our exposure, we have a high voltage applied to that cup. That cup shoves the electrons across the tube. So when we have a higher KVP, we're essentially moving the electrons across the tube faster than we are whenever we use a lower KVP. What that does is it increases the energy of the electrons. The higher their energy is, the more likely they are to become X-rays, and the more energy that travels with that photon. Keep in mind that this affects the speed of the electrons in the tube, but not the speed of the X-rays once they exit the tube. Remember that X-rays move at the speed of light, period, end of story. No faster, no slower. But because their their speed is set, it's always 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. They can carry more or less energy at that speed. So that's what your kilovoltage is affecting. Like I said, the faster they go across the tube, the more energy they have, the more likely they are to actually become X-rays. So that's how kilovoltage affects the quantity and the quality. The quality is that energy piece, and then they go hand in hand. If you have more energy, they're more likely to become X-rays and less likely to become heat. There is math for that too, but I'm not going to make you do it. In the Bushong book, that explains that as you use a higher KVP setting, you actually are more efficient at making X-rays. I want to say once you get up to like 1 MeV, instead of it being like 99% heat and 1% X-ray, it goes up to like 90% heat and 10% X-ray. You get more efficient at making X-rays. Don't remember that numbers and stuff. I'm not going to ask you that on a test or anything, but just know that it is true. The more energy your electrons have, the more efficiently they become X-rays. Because these X-ray photons are going to have more energy with them, they're going to be more penetrating through the patient's body. So more of them are likely to interact with the image receptor. Our KVP is our penetrating power. It's how much these things can get in and then back out of the body and interact with your image receptor. We talked about in Unit 2 subject contrast. Subject contrast is that I like to think of contrast as being dealing with the mix of energies that you're dealing with whenever you're looking at your X-ray exposure. So your subject contrast is talking about that mix of energies that is going to exit the patient based on either the energy of your X-ray beam or the type of tissue that it's interacting with. Dislike dogs. Fuck my life. Go, Sean, I will fucking get you. Changing your kilovoltage is going to create a change in your subject contrast. When we talked about subject contrast before, we talked primarily about the mix of different types of tissues in a part. And that's not inaccurate, but it's not 100% accurate either. When we talk about subject contrast is basically the mix of energies that are going to exit the patient's body. When I think about contrast, I'm thinking about the mix of energies, whether it's when we're using a higher KVP and we have a higher average energy, or if we're using a lower KVP and maybe not as many photons are going to exit the patient because they're going to be more likely to be attenuated, those kind of things. Also, that goes hand in hand with the makeup of the tissue. If we're dealing with something like a metallic implant in a patient's body, pacemaker, something like that, it's less likely that X-rays are going to pass through that, right? They're going to get absorbed there. So that's going to affect the mix of energies that exits the patient. The X-rays that hit that pacemaker, they ain't coming out, and it changes the subject contrast, what comes out of the patient. So when you change your KVP, when you increase your KVP, you're decreasing the subject contrast because you're decreasing that mix of energies. Those low energy X-ray photons are staying in the patient. So you don't have as much of a mix of stuff. So that's why I like to think of subject contrast as that mix of energies. The same thing, only different. You could say conversely. Whenever you have a lower KVP, you're going to have an increase in attenuation. So you're going to have some low energy things that get out, and you're going to have some that don't get out at all. So you're going to increase the subject contrast. You're going to have more of a mix of stuff because you've got a wider variety of what is happening in your patient's body. Now, I mentioned a while ago, whenever I planned out this course, I decided to put scatter control in front of chapters 6, 8, and 9 because I feel like you have to understand what's happening with scatter before you really understand what's happening with your techniques and with what you're setting and what happens inside your patient and ultimately what happens to your image receptor. And part of that has to do with how tricky, I guess, is the word I'm looking for. How tricky KVP is. KVP increases exposure to your IR not only because it makes X-rays more efficiently in the X-ray tube. That's one part of it. There are 5 main reasons why your KVP changes your exposure. There's that. There is the efficiency of X-ray production. As you increase your KVP, those electrons are more likely to become X-rays and less likely to become heat. Number one. Number two, the X-rays that are produced have a higher average energy, right? So they're going to be more penetrating. So as you increase your KVP, more X-rays are going to not only exit the tube because it was more efficient, but they're also more likely to exit the patient. Remember in Unit 2 when we talked about X-ray interactions and matter, we talked about transmission versus attenuation. If you have a higher energy, you are more likely to have transmission of your X-ray photon. Number 3, the production of scatter radiation increases as your KVP increases. Haha, this is part of why I put the chapters in the wrong dang order. Whenever you increase your KVP, remember we said you get more transmission, but what attenuation you do get is more Compton and less photoelectric effect. So that mix of things increases. So even though it's not diagnostic information, it's not exactly what we want, it does increase the exposure to the image receptor overall from the scatter increase. Number 4 goes along with that. That scatter also is more likely to be going straight forward toward the image receptor and not back out toward us or back toward the tube or whatever kind of direction. Remember when we talked about Compton interaction, we said you could tell how much energy was lost based on how much the beam changed direction? Well, if it's got a whole bunch of energy and it ionizes an outer shell, it doesn't lose much energy. So it is going to continue in a more straightforward path than going out, kicking out to the side or doing whatever scatter X-rays do. That scatter has higher energy and more likely to get out of the patient. No, and it's straighter. Yeah, they go together. I was reading the slide as I was going along. Scatter produced is more forward directed as the KVP. I already said that. They go together. It's more likely to get out of the patient, more likely to go in the direction of the IR, more likely to actually get out, more likely to make it. So that's why when you increase your KVP, you're increasing the quantity of radiation that is getting toward your image receptor and the quality. Got some little pictures to demonstrate what happens whenever you use a higher KVP. This is showing that subject contrast. There's 2 slides here. Slide 11 and 12 are both chest radiographs. I'm switching them back and forth. You are not indeed going blind or something. I always automatically assume that if something looks funny, that I'm losing my vision, instead of just thinking that perhaps someone changed the slide. But anyways, whenever you have an increase in your KVP, of course, you're going to have more penetrating power. So there's going to be less attenuation in the structures. That's going to make it a lower contrast image. Your higher KVP gives you a lower contrast image. On the flip side of things, whenever you have a lower KVP, you are more likely to have that absorption. So you're not going to have as many X-rays coming out. So your subject contrast is going to be different. That mix of energies is going to be different. So your lower KVP is going to be a higher contrast image. And if you flip back and forth between these two, you can tell This guy, slide 12, is a high contrast image because it's mostly just black and white, right? But then whenever we look back at slide 11, this guy has a lower contrast. It has more grays. Remember, your low contrast is a long scale of contrast that has lots of grays. Low, long, lots. They go together. And the other crap is the other crap. High contrast is blacks and whites, not so much with the grays. Back in the day of film, I won't bore you with this for too long, when you increased your exposure factors, you would visibly see a darker image. Our film would be darker. Now it doesn't really work that way. With digital imaging, if you increase your KVP or your MAS, even if you double your exposure to the IR, you may or may not even be able to visibly tell a difference to what's happening on your image. So that's why we talk about image receptor exposure. You can increase your MA, your time, or your KVP to increase the exposure to the IR. So more photons are going to get there if you use more X-rays, or use more electrons. You use the electrons for a longer amount of time, or you propel the electrons faster across the X-ray tube. All of things are going to increase the exposure to the IR. On the flip side of that, if you decrease any one of those factors, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to decrease your exposure to the image receptor. Now, this is kind of like what we talked about a while ago with your MA and your MAS calculations. You can also maintain the exposure to the IR. So if I want to go do a portable chest x-ray, and I think, okay, I'm going to use, let's say I'm going to use, what am I going to use? 110 kVp, and I'm going to use 2 MAS. And I get up there, and the patient is going buck wild, right? I can leave my MAS the same, but increase my MA and decrease my time so that I have a faster exposure. Because if the patient is moving all around, remember we talked about motion and how it's going to destroy your ability to visualize those structures. They're not going to be recorded accurately. Motion is going to ruin whatever pretty image we try to capture. So you can change your MA or your time to maintain the MAS. Same thing, only different. Let's say we get up there and we say, okay, we're doing this with the portable machine. The portable machine won't let me select my MA and my time values independently. Some of them do, some don't. But we're going to pretend like we're on one that doesn't. So I might say, you know what? I'm just going to increase my KVP by 15% and cut my mass in half, because if I cut my mass in half, what am I doing to the exposure time? Cutting it in half. So what you're doing, we'll have some practice problems for this. I'll have to make another video for more practice word problems, probably. Hadn't got that far yet, but I'll get there. But you have to read your problems carefully. If they say something like Jana May went up and produced an image, a suboptimal image that had blah, 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 was your keyword to let you know that I did something right. Why is all of a sudden this is feedback? Now it stopped. So bizarre. Sorry about that. But on the other side of that coin, if I say that Karan goes up and does a portable exam and he has a good exposure index number, and everything is good, but we're going to repeat the exam later and we want to decrease patient dose. So if it says something like optimal exposure index, or something like that, then you know that you're trying to maintain the exposure. So if you're going to maintain the exposure, but you're going to decrease the patient dose, that means you're going to be decreasing your MAS, which means you would have to increase your KVP. We'll work on that a little bit, but I like to give you guys a heads up so you know what's coming. There's a slide here that talks about your primary factors in digital imaging. And then the next slide talks about your primary factors in film screen imaging. Obviously, you guys don't have to learn film screen imaging, but I like to introduce this information to you mostly because I know that you're going to be working with techs who trained on film screen, and that is what makes them resistant to letting you guys play with the techniques and try different things. When we did film screen imaging, you got what you got. The image, if you used a little bit too high of KVP and a little bit too low of MAS or whatever, you could really tell it. What is that? It's like feedback. My you guys don't care about this, but anyways, my brother-in-law is looking at building some targets. He shoots guns for fun, I guess. And he was talking about how if he buys these certain targets, they have a better, how did he call it? Like, he didn't say audio. Maybe he said audible feedback. And I was like, does that just mean they ding? And he's like, yes. But if you hear the ding, you know you did it right. The same thing was when we had film screen imaging. As soon as your image came out, you knew whether you did it right or wrong. There wasn't a question of, well, maybe I could have used a little more or a little less. Like, you had to be very precise. With digital, it's not like that. And I think that's important for you guys to know and for you to keep in the back of your head when you are setting techniques when you guys are in clinical. Because when the tech comes behind you and you've got, say, 60 at 2 set for, no, let me rephrase. You pull up your computer workstation to do a wrist, and it pops up at 60 at 2. And you guys changed it and put 70 at 1 because you have learned that a higher KVP and a lower MAS is better for your patient dose. And you're not at the risk of having a high amount of scatter because you guys understand that scatter is controlled by patient thickness, along with your KVP. And if you're doing a wrist, I don't care how big you are. People's wrists aren't that big. Even gigantic people's wrists are not that big. So you guys set 70 at 1. The tech comes behind you and says, oh, no, that will never work. It will. I think I've told you about 400 times, but please don't ever argue with anybody, especially if we ever get to go back to clinical. We're going to have to maintain those relationships. But just know in the back of your head that whenever we're dealing with digital imaging, you guys know more about this than most of the techs who are working out there. If they graduated in the past 5 years or so, they probably know more about it. But before then, it was mostly just film. Everything was about film screen, even because we still had to teach it because it was still on the registry until 2017. So it hasn't fallen off that long ago. But with digital imaging, you guys will know more about it. Hopefully, you'll start to get more comfortable with it. But the best thing about digital, the best thing about digital imaging is that wide dynamic range. And that means that you guys can have a lot of different technical factors that will still work. That 60 at 2 will work. 70 at 1 will work. 80 at 0.5 probably work. 50 at 4 probably also work. You guys have a lot of latitude there. You can change things and you just have to be close enough and it works. And that is fantastic. Except for that the techs who learned on film screen and learned that you can't do that don't understand that that doesn't apply to digital. Like I said before, whenever we would take our exposures with x-rays, with the x-ray film, with film screen imaging, as soon as the image came out, you knew if you had the right KVP or the right MAS based on what your image looked like. So a lot of techs rely on how your image looks when it pops up on the screen. However, your image brightness is not dependent on the MAS and the KVP you set. If you overexpose it, it's still going to look the same. If you underexpose it, it's still going to look pretty close to the same. And now, if you have what they would call a gross overexposure or underexposure, if you're just way off, you should have used 60 at 2 and you accidentally set 60 at 20. You are off. You used 10 times as much x-ray as you need to, then you're going to have some changes, right? But overall, whatever you set for your MAS and your KVP is not going to control your image brightness on the screen. Now, this third little, I was going to say bullet point, but there's not a bullet point. On this slide says the image contrast is not dependent on KVP. I got two things to tell you about that. Number one, it is for large changes. If you change your KVP from 50 to 55, no, you will not see a difference on the way your image looks on a computer screen. However, I've tested this, so I know it to be true, and I also will tell you that the registry content specifications do still say that image contrast is controlled by KVP. So we will go on the premise that KVP does affect image contrast, but only when you make large changes to your KVP. So the difference between 100 KVP and 50 or 60 KVP, yes, you will definitely see a change in your image contrast. But small changes, changing from, like I said, 60 to 65, 50 to 55, something small like that, you're not going to see a difference in your image contrast by changing your KVP. But the registry exam specifications do state that KVP changes contrast, so that is what I teach you. Because ultimately, if you don't pass that test, why did you spend the last 2 years with us? So I go with what they tell me. With too much, you'll have different changes with the brightness or the contrast. I already said that. Nobody cares about that. Yeah. When you take Ms. Garner's digital imaging class in the summer, you'll learn about exactly how the KVP and the MAS affect what happens. I think the longer you stay in this program, the deeper we go with exactly what you have to know and how you understand the why of what all this stuff is. But for right now, just trust me when I tell you that it doesn't change the brightness and the contrast much on the display unless you make big changes. And when you do have those big changes, she will explain to you exactly what's happening on the detector that makes it do what it does. Pretty much your higher and lower KVP values are just going to change exposure index values. You guys are somewhat familiar with EI numbers. Most systems are direct. That means that if the EI number is high, it's overexposed. If the EI number is low, it's underexposed. That's pretty handy, but some are indirect. And in those systems, if you have a low number, it means it is overexposed. I'm trying to think. I think Scotland's portable machine is like that. Oh, you know what? No, they just got new portables. I don't know what they have now. I'd have to ask. Scotland's old portable machine used to be like that, and also the equipment at Montgomery Memorial in Troy. They have CR cassettes that are on that indirect relationship. So if your number is too low, you actually overexpose, and vice versa. Don't really care that you know about the primary factors and how they affect film screen imaging. Okay, so all of that talk, I feel like there's a lot of talk today, brings us to the secondary factors that affect, well, no, I was going to say affect exposure to our image receptor, but that's not 100% true. Not all of them affect how many photons get to the image receptor. Some of them are going to affect other things. The first one, of course, is the focal spot size, and that one does not have any effect on the quantity or quality of the radiation produced. But it is the primary controlling factor of spatial resolution. Lord have mercy, my brain is not working today. Maybe I should have had 2 coffees instead of just one. Recall that the focal spot inside the X-ray tube is the source of the X-rays. Hopefully you guys have got that down pat now. The source of the X-rays comes from the focal spot. The electrons come from the filament, come across, smack the anode. Whether we use a large or small filament determines whether or not we are using a large or small focal spot size. Oops, slide didn't change. If you have a larger focal spot size, it's better for heat dissipation and spreading out that exposure over more area on the anode. But it does come at a cost, and that cost is decreased spatial resolution. That can be demonstrated here on slide number 18. We've got the focal spot size influences the amount of unsharpness. This is another one of those things that you guys can demonstrate by using a flashlight and looking at a shadow of your hand. If you have a flashlight, my husband has like those big mag light flashlights, and you can turn the top of the flashlight around the lens, and you can make the area bigger or smaller. It's still the same amount of light, but if you make the area that the light shines bigger, and then you look at the shadow of your hand, the edges are not going to be as sharp. It's not going to be as easy to tell where one ends and one begins. Where when you have a smaller size, when you have that mag light coned down to a tighter beam of light, just like if you have a smaller focal spot size, you're going to have less unsharpness at the edges of your image or your hand shadow, whichever thing you like to use. Your source to image distance, your SID, also affects not only your distortion and your spatial resolution, but also your intensity. So let's start with the intensity. I think you guys understand this so far. As you increase your distance, you decrease the intensity of radiation hitting your image receptor, and that varies by the distance squared, the difference in the distance squared. So it's not directly proportional or inversely proportional, but rather inversely proportional to the distance squared. So increasing SID is going to decrease your exposure to your IR, and decreasing your SID will increase your exposure to the IR. This is assuming that all other factors remain unchanged. Now we can do math and change our exposure factors for that, but that'll come in chapters 8 and 9. We're just going to stick with the basics right now. If you leave your technique the same and you go further away, fewer photons are going to strike your image receptor. Remember that. Your SID also affects your distortion. Remember, we talked about this whenever we did magnification factor in Unit 2. And then your spatial resolution. Because of the same thing as basically what we just talked about a minute ago, the further away you are, you're going to be less magnified, and you're going to have a better edge basically on your shadow if you're doing the hand and shadow thing, or on your image. So you're going to have increased spatial resolution with an increase in your SID, and also a decrease in your magnification. But since the SID does affect your exposure to your image receptor, if you use a long SID so that you have that better detail and you have that lower magnification, you have to use a lot more technique. So we don't use long SID for everything because of patient safety concerns. That's your inverse square law. Here they have E for exposure, but it's the same as I, your intensity. Don't let it throw you off. You can see, oh, this one is your MAS. Sorry. This one is your MAS, so your exposure factor 1, if you have your distance 1, those are directly proportional. If you have an increase in your distance, you have an increase in your MAS. This E sub 1 is basically MAS 1. It's your exposure factor 1 for your MAS. Glad I caught that. Change your SID. Basically, when you change your SID, it changes the quantity of radiation reaching your IR, because as you get further away, you get more divergence of the beam. What the crap is divergence of the beam? Spreading out of the beam. So if you have twice as much distance, this image over here on the right is showing that if you have double the distance, only 1/4 of the radiation gets to that same area of exposure, because it gets spread out. You double your distance, you get 1/4 the exposure. If you have triple the distance, you have 1/9 the exposure, so on and so forth. I was just having a thought with that divergence of the beam. A quick note, I will tell you, kind of foreshadowing at what we'll be talking about in chapters 8 and 9. When you change your SID, now this changes the quantity of X-rays that are going to reach your image receptor, but it does not change the quality. Remember, when we talk about the quality, we're talking about the mix of energies. And you're still going to have the same mix of energies for that area. You're just not going to have as many, but the mix of things is going to be pretty much the same throughout. So your SID changes your quantity, but not your quality. Along with your SID, we talked about when we did magnification factor that the OID plays a role. That's not only in your magnification factor, but I'm just trying to relate it to things that you guys already know. Whenever you increase your OID, we're going to change the amount of radiation that reaches the image receptor. Remember, we talked about that with the air technique at the end of chapter 8. The amount of scatter, yep, we said that. Magnification, remember your magnification factor is your SID over your SOD, and your SOD is your SID minus your OID. So your magnification factor is going to change. Obviously, your spatial resolution is going to change again if you do your flashlight in your hand, and you move your hand further away from, say, a table, and you look at what happens. The edges aren't as clear as they are whenever it's right down close to it. Same thing happens with X-rays as it does with a flashlight and your hand. That's air gap. You guys know that. Large OID is going to increase your magnification. You guys know that. We already talked about this. See all the things you know, you think you may or may not know, but you actually do know. And you will continue using these. You'll probably have magnification factor on, well, let me rephrase. You will definitely have magnification factor on this coming exam, exam number 4. You will probably have a magnification factor on exam 5, and you will definitely have magnification factor on your final exam, so don't forget about it. All right, central ray alignment. We talked about this before when we talked about shape distortion. Remember that magnification is size distortion, but central ray alignment has to do with shape distortion. And that happens whenever you have misalignment of one of 3 things, either the tube, the part, or the image receptor. If everything is not either like your image receptor and your part are parallel to each other and your central ray is perpendicular to them, if you have any of those things off, you're going to change your shape of your part. You remember that, recall that your shape distortion is unequal size distortion. Whenever something is further away than another part of the same thing, like when you're thinking about a long bone, if you think about if the knee is further away from the table than, say, the ankle, then the knee is going to be more magnified and the ankle is going to be less magnified. So you're going to have unequal magnification, which creates shape distortion. It's going to be elongated or foreshortened depending on the misalignment. And this next slide shows those. We talked about these. You guys actually did really well on this. There was a question that asked about these on your Unit 2 exam. And I remember being very impressed that you guys did well on that. So refresh it. Just make sure it's still fresh in your brain because you'll have more questions about it going forward. Grids. You guys are grid experts after the last exam. Remember that grids do not affect the amount of scatter created in the patient, but rather just clean up the mess after the fact. They remove the unwanted scatter radiation before it has a chance to interact with your image receptor. And when we use grids, we have to account for that. You guys will have a lot of grid conversion factor problems in this unit in chapters, I think mostly in chapter 9, but I can't remember. We'll be having a lot of math problems when we start on chapter 9 that are multiple step problems. You change your SID and you change your grid ratio. Whatever, those kind of things. It's not going to be straightforward like it has been where it's just one thing that has to be changed. It's multiple things. And that's more like how it is in real life. You guys don't think that the techs are doing this stuff and using this stuff, but they are. They just don't tell you. They just automatically do it in their brains. Picture shows about scatter radiation and fog. You can see the image over here on the right. What is that? Image B has fog. It has an overall cloudy appearance because that extra scatter radiation has overall darkened everything. So if everything gets dark, it's harder to distinguish between the lights and the darks. So it ruins your contrast. And that's what has happened there. You guys already know about how beam restriction changes your exposure to your IR because we just talked about it in chapter 8. See, I am so smart for putting chapter 8 before chapter 6. Or was that 7? Ah, shit. Oh man, I'm still not smart. Just realized I said the wrong dang chapter. Whatever. I put scatter control first, and I'm a genius for it. Generator output, we touched on this when we did your X-ray emission spectrum back in Unit 2. Hopefully, Unit 2. Yes. Now I'm questioning every single thing I say because I've been saying the wrong chapter. Generator output, as the more voltage ripple you have, the less efficiently you are making X-rays. And if you are not as efficient at creating X-rays, then you have to increase your exposure settings to compensate. Filtration, again, talked about it in Unit 2. Remember, the most accurate way to personify an X-ray beam is to describe it using the half-value layer. And the half-value layer is that amount of, well, for us, usually we're worried about it as far as soft tissue is concerned because about 5 centimeters of soft tissue, which is roughly 2 inches of thickness, you have to double your technique for every time because that 5 centimeters is a half-value layer for soft tissue for the diagnostic range of X-rays. So we talked about that. Tube filtration, when you add more filtration, you're going to have fewer X-rays get out of the tube, but what does get out is going to have a higher energy, so that's going to affect your technical factors, what you're going to be choosing. Compensating filters are those things that we tell you about and you probably never use. They do have them at CCH. And some techs use them, but most people don't. But what they do is they help to even out exposure across the image so that areas that normally would be overexposed are not overexposed. They just help to even out those densities and make a uniform exposure across the whole image. Oh, I got ahead of myself with my half-value layer talk. So whenever we talk about half value layer, we talk about patient factors. Remember, we said that half value layer, every 5 centimeters is a half value layer. So if you had this on the right hand side of this slide, it's showing that you have 100 x-rays that are going to hit the person's skin. After 5 centimeters of thickness, you would only have like 50 of them. After another 5 centimeters, you would only have like 25 of them, because for every 5 centimeters, the number of x-ray photons that continues to move through the body gets cut in half. So we have to think about that when we think about our patients and we're selecting our technical factors. It's not just their thickness. Recall from Unit 2 that we talked about, density also plays a role. So body habitus is something you have to think about. It's not just whether or not they're big or small, but what are they made up of? Where are their organs situated? If you're doing an abdomen on, say, a hyperstemic person, do you need to kind of cheat up a little bit and know that their abdominal organs take up more space, and are probably thicker because they have more soft tissue and all that jazz. So you have to take into account their body habitus, and then of course their thickness, because the thickness affects how many x-rays are going to either be absorbed or transmit. And then of course we just talked about how patient thickness affects the volume of tissue, which affects the amount of scatter radiation that is produced, which is ultimately going to affect the amount of radiation that is going to reach our image receptor. Let me look at these next couple slides. Remnant beam, primary beam. I don't think those are the slides I wanted. The whole table 6.3. Okay, I think I put the wrong table in here. Hold on. Bear with us. That's 6.4, but I only have part of it. What the heck? What the heck? Okay, PowerPoint is messed up. I know you're all shocked and amazed that I made a mistake. In your textbook, hopefully you've been following along as I've gone through this thing anyways. In your textbook on page 173, there's table 6.2 that has mathematical calculations that you need to know for the information we just covered. So make sure you know those. So refer to page 173 at the top. Make sure you know how to do those maths. You'll have a math video and some worksheets coming. Below that, table 6.3 is long. It takes up like a page and a half. Moderately important, not super important. However, table 6.4 has 2 parts, and I only put half of it on a PowerPoint somehow. But table 6.4 is something very important for you to understand and to know. As we go forward, when we think about what happens when we change certain factors, if we increase the MAS, is that going to increase or decrease our exposure to our IR? Is it going to increase or decrease our contrast? All of that stuff. This is where we're going with this information. So make sure that you understand the relationships in table 6.4, which runs from pages 174 to 175. Because you will see this information again. I cannot stress it enough. You need to understand what's going on there. If you do not understand why, for example, looking at this screen, why a decrease in IR exposure occurs because of excessive tube filtration, please let me know. Text me, email me, send me a smoke signal. I don't care. Let me know, because you need to understand these relationships. They are very important, and like I said, we're going to build on them going into chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 9 is basically all a bunch of scenarios and changing techniques and stuff that is going to get you ready for your next exam. Chapter 8 builds on what we just covered a little bit, but Chapter 9 is like just math problems. And if you don't understand these relationships, you're not going to understand what to do with the maths. Okay, so make sure you do that. I read the objectives to you, and like I never do, so I'm not reading the review stuff. Make sure that you can do all of these. These are just the objectives, but make sure that you can actually complete what they say and you understand all of these relationships so that you are prepared for your next exam. I think that's all I have for today. We will have class tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow. Hopefully, you'll have time to have looked over this by then and you'll be ready to come prepared with some notes. I will see you guys in a little bit for Mrs. Garner's lecture on skulls, facial bones, all kinds of excitement. But I'll be on there shortly and just for a little bit, but I'll be available if you guys need me. I'll see you then.